The events of August 24th, 79 AD was a terrible one for those who lived in Pompeii. But for history, it left a wealth of information of Roman life, and more importantly, not information of emperors or the well-to-do, but of the average Roman citizen. All those little artifacts that in other places would have deteriorated over time were preserved under this volcanic ash in Pompeii. And these little everyday bits of life, from what people ate, where they lived, and how they entertained themselves, allows us to bring life to these countless Roman faces and understand a little bit better who they were and how they lived their lives. Walking around Pompeii today is like traveling back in time. One of my favorite things to see is all the graffiti on the wall, much like you would find here in a alley or a street or a subway or a bathroom. All these little notes are kind of like human touches that you find around Pompeii. Now, Roman graffiti is just like modern day graffiti. It can be depictions and words of just about any subject. Anywhere from modes of transportation like this boat, poking fun at a politician, or celebrating your favorite gladiator. If you venture further into Pompeii and get lost in some of the many winding streets, you come across some fascinating remnants of architecture. And most of the buildings you find are apartment buildings where the average Roman citizen lived. Now, these were called Insula, or islands, and they were a series of apartments stacked on top of each other with this oculus, or this hole on top, to let rain and sunlight come into the apartment building. Now, you would live on the first or second or third floor with you and a family or friends, and you'd be tightly packed. Now, this type of living is quite popular now. If you go around any modern city or downtown Sacramento, you'll see many of these things being built today. And we look at these and we think of them as kind of modern living, but they're some of the basic and oldest forms of housing. Now, one thing that has been updated for modern day apartments is they have kitchens. But back in the Roman times, there wasn't enough space in the apartments, and it was a safety hazard to have fires in every one of these apartments. So what was the solution? Well, the first floor of these Insula apartment buildings was reserved for commercial, for restaurants, bakeries, and other such facilities. So imagine you're a Roman and you're hungry. You walk downstairs to the first floor and enter into a restaurant. Here are the remains of a restaurant in Pompeii. You can see the counter with all those holes in front of it, and that's where they kept the food warm. They had various things from chicken and other things, duck, some of which was pictured on the very counter. So you didn't have to read a menu, you just kind of knew what was being kept in the pot. Now, not every picture was of something they ate. Here's a dog was just beautifying the space, as are some of the other images here. But you can almost feel yourself, much like in a Chipotle or Pete's Coffee, walking up to the counter, looking at some of the things that are being offered, pointing to what you want, and then going along your way with your food in hand. Now, even though modern apartments do have kitchens, you still want to go out and eat sometimes. And in today's apartment buildings, you'll find the first floor is primarily left for retail. Coffee houses, restaurants. Here's one of my favorites, Magpie Restaurant in downtown. It's a family-operated restaurant, much like you would have found back in Pompeii. And entering it, you would get a feeling of what it would have been like to eat somewhere out in Pompeii. Now, these restaurants in Pompeii were pretty small, and so you would hear the hustle and bustle of the kitchen. You'd hear the clanking of pots and pans, people talking, people chopping, people preparing the food that would be available for most of the day here in this restaurant in Pompeii. But we're back in Magpie, and they're doing a bit of the same. Husband and wife team are getting things ready for the lunch and dinner they're going to be serving throughout the day. Now, in the front of the house, there weren't as many tables and seats as you find as Magpie, but an occasional place in Pompeii would have a few tables. They would charge you to sit down and enjoy your meal rather than taking it out. But nevertheless, these restaurants in Pompeii would be quite familiar to us. Now, one thing every Roman citizen would consume on a daily basis is bread. Now, again, you couldn't have an oven in your apartment. Even the wealthiest couldn't have something that hot produce bread for them. So, in addition to restaurants on the bottom floor, we had a lot of bakeries. And the big difference being is the bakeries didn't really make bread, they baked the bread. So you would produce your family recipe with the dough, you would then stamp it, and you would then deliver it to this bakeries, and they would then actually bake it for you. And it was really a melting pot because, again, both the poor, middle class, and the wealthy would bring their same bread to this baking facility. The only difference maybe being is that you, if you were in the lower classes, would bring it yourself, whereas if you were wealthy, you would have somebody else bring it for you. But the stamping idea is quite unique to the Roman times, and we still have preserved these stamps, and they put it into the wet dough, then it was baked, and this is how you knew which of the breads would be yours of the many citizens who had come to the bakery. It was a way of quickly identifying your bread and taking it home. And like I said at the beginning of this lecture, these little fragments of life that are preserved in Pompeii really help us understand how people lived. And believe it or not, this baked charred bread here, you can see the shape here, was perfectly preserved in Pompeii, even with the family stamp on it. And you can see in this fresco here how closely it resembles the real thing. So Pompeii is fascinating in that it can allow us to really put our hands on the everyday life of your average Roman citizen.